Drive through Lancaster County on any Tuesday morning and you will smell onions in butter before you see a single house. That smell has not changed in 100 years. The women cooking those onions never owned a microwave, never opened a box of anything with a brand name on it, and never spent more than $2 on supper for the whole table. They did not call it frugal, they called it Tuesday. Number 14 on this list costs about 40 cents and uses 3 ingredients you already have in the pantry. And number 7 might be the most underrated vegetable dish in American cooking. These were meals built on what the garden gave and what the pantry held. Nothing wasted, nothing fancy, nothing missing. Here are 25 easy Amish dinner recipes that cost less than $2 to make. Number 25, Rivel Soup. This is flour, an egg, a pinch of salt, and a pot of milk. You mix the flour and egg between your fingers until it crumbles into little pea-sized lumps. Those lumps go straight into simmering milk. 5 minutes and supper is on the table. Amish mothers made this on nights when the garden was bare and the cellar was running low. Some families added a little butter at the end. Some sprinkled brown sugar on top and called it dessert, but most ate it plain from a deep bowl with a spoon and a piece of bread on the side. The whole pot cost less than the price of a candy bar. It was the kind of meal that tasted like someone cared enough to stand at the stove when there was almost nothing left to cook with. Number 24, Schnitz und Knepp. This is dried apple slices simmered with a ham hock and topped with dumplings. The name is Pennsylvania Dutch, and it sounds like something out of a storybook, but it was real weeknight food across Lancaster, Lebanon, and Berks counties for 200 years. You soaked the dried apples overnight. The next day, you dropped them into a pot with whatever ham bone you had, covered it with water, and let it go low and slow for a couple of hours. A ham hock cost about 15 cents at the butcher in the 1940s, and most families dried their own apples from the trees out back, so the whole pot came together for well under $1. Then you mixed up a simple biscuit dough, tore off pieces, and dropped them right on top of the bubbling pot. The lid went on and you did not touch it for 15 minutes. The dumplings steamed through, the apples turned soft and sweet, and the ham gave everything salt. Sweet and savory in one bowl, and nobody called it fusion cooking. It was just supper. Number 23, Amish Haystack Supper. This was the original build-your-own meal long before any fast food chain thought of it. You lined up bowls down the center of the table. One had cooked rice, one had seasoned ground beef. Then came shredded lettuce, diced tomatoes, chopped onions, crushed crackers, and cheese sauce made from a block of Velveeta melted with a little milk. Everyone built their own stack on a plate, layering whatever they wanted in whatever order they wanted. Kids loved it because they got to choose. Parents loved it because it stretched a pound of ground beef across a table of 8. Church suppers in Holmes County, Ohio, served this to 100 people at a time. The ingredients came to pennies per plate. Before I go further, for the folks who want all of these old recipes and more gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 22, Chicken Corn Soup. Take a whole chicken, boil it until the meat falls off the bone, and strip every shred into the broth. Add fresh corn cut straight from the cob, diced hard-boiled eggs, and a handful of homemade noodles, salt, pepper, a touch of parsley. That is it. This soup was a summer staple in Pennsylvania Dutch country when the corn was high and the chickens were plentiful. A whole yard bird cost less than $1 in the 1950s, and the corn came straight from the field, so the entire pot ran you well under $2. One bird and a dozen ears of corn fed a family for 2 days. The hard-boiled eggs made it hearty enough that nobody asked what else was for dinner. Church groups in Lancaster still serve it at fundraiser suppers today because it feeds a crowd and nobody ever complains about the taste. Number 21, Amish Pot Pie. Forget the round pie crust you are thinking of. This is not that. Amish pot pie is a stew. You roll out egg noodle dough on the kitchen table, cut it into thick squares, and layer those squares into a pot with chunks of chicken, cubed potatoes, and a rich broth. The noodles cook right in the liquid and turn silky. Some families used ham instead of chicken. Some added celery, but the bones of it never changed. Dough, broth, meat, potato. The women who made this rolled their noodle dough so thin you could almost read a newspaper through it. That was the mark of a good cook. Not seasoning, not presentation, just the dough. A whole pot cost less than $1, and it stuck to your ribs through a long evening of chores. The Amish kitchen ran on a principle most modern cooks have never considered. Nothing was fast, nothing was instant, and nothing came in a package with heating instructions. A meal took time because time was the one ingredient nobody tried to save. The women who cooked these suppers did not think of cooking as a chore to finish. They thought of it as the center of the day. The table was set before the food was done. Everyone sat down at the same time. Nobody ate standing at a counter scrolling through a phone. That sounds romantic until you remember these women cooked 3 meals a day, every day, for decades. It was not romantic, it was relentless. And they did it anyway, because a table with food on it was the one thing they could always give their family. Number 20, scrapple. This was pork scraps, cornmeal, flour, and spices cooked into a mush, poured into a loaf pan, and chilled until solid. The next morning, you sliced it thick and fried it in a cast iron skillet until both sides were dark and crispy. Inside, it stayed soft. Outside, it crackled. Scrapple was born from butchering day. After the good cuts were salted and smoked, the leftover bits went into the scrapple pot. Nothing was wasted. You ate it with eggs for breakfast, but plenty of Amish families served it for supper with fried potatoes and applesauce on the side. In Philadelphia and across the Delaware Valley, diners still sell it today. The cost was nearly zero because the ingredients were what nobody else wanted. Number 19, Umaseti. The name sounds made up, but it has been a staple in Amish and Mennonite homes for generations. You start by browning ground beef with diced onion. In a separate pot, you cook a batch of egg noodles. Then you layer them in a casserole dish. Beef on the bottom, noodles on top, and a sauce made from tomato soup, cream of mushroom soup, and a splash of milk poured over everything. A thick layer of cheese goes on last. It bakes until the cheese bubbles and the edges turn golden brown. This was the dish that showed up at every funeral, every barn raising, and every church potluck in northern Indiana and central Ohio. It traveled well, it reheated well, and it fed 12 people from a single baking dish. The women who carried it through the door never announced it. They just set it on the table and went to find the coffee. What made Umaseti work was its honesty. There was nothing fancy about it. No herb garnish, no complicated technique. It was ground beef and noodles and soup from a can. But when you ate it after a day of raising a neighbor's barn by hand, or after sitting through a 3-hour funeral service on a hard wooden bench, it tasted like exactly what you needed. The warmth of it, the weight of it, the way it sat in your stomach and told you the day was over and you had done your part. Some families added a layer of peas. Some used cream of chicken instead of mushroom. The Amish do not write down recipes the way the rest of us do. They pass them mouth to mouth, hand to hand, and every kitchen adjusts. But the bones of Umaseti never change. Meat, noodles, sauce, cheese, $1 and change for a pan that fed the whole family. That was the math that mattered. Number 18, Amish bread filling. Take a loaf of day-old bread, tear it into chunks, and toss it in a bowl with sautéed celery, onions, and butter. Add a couple of beaten eggs and enough chicken broth to make it moist but not soggy. Season it with sage and salt. Pack it into a baking dish and let it go in the oven until the top turns golden and the inside stays soft. This was Thanksgiving in Amish country, except they did not wait for November. Bread filling showed up on a Tuesday just as easily. It used stale bread that would have gone to waste otherwise and turned it into the centerpiece of supper. Number 17, cabbage and noodle skillet. You shredded half a head of cabbage, fried it in butter with a sliced onion until it was soft and sweet, and tossed it with cooked egg noodles. Salt, pepper, nothing more. The whole dish came together in 20 minutes and used ingredients that every Amish pantry had year-round. Cabbage kept all winter in the root cellar. Flour and eggs for noodles were always on hand. Some families added a little vinegar at the end for sharpness. Some tossed in bits of leftover ham if they had it, but the plain version needed nothing else. The butter and the long, slow cooking turned the cabbage into something almost sweet. A whole skillet for the family cost less than 60 cents. Number 16. Amish onion patties. These were thick slices of onion dipped in a simple batter of flour, cornmeal, sugar, and salt, then fried in hot oil until crispy. Some families served them as a side, but in plenty of Amish homes, these were the main event on a summer evening alongside a bowl of soup or a plate of sliced tomatoes from the garden. The sweetness of the onion came through the salty crunch of the batter, and there was nothing else quite like it. One batch used 2 onions and a half cup of flour. Cost was almost nothing. They came out of the skillet so hot you had to wait a full minute before biting in. There is a difference between being poor and cooking poor. The Amish were not always poor. Many of them owned land, kept livestock, and ran profitable farms. But they cooked as if every ingredient mattered because to them it did. Wasting food was not just impractical, it was disrespectful. A potato that went soft got grated into patties. Stale bread became filling. Bruised apples turned into sauce or dried slices for winter stew. This was not desperation. This was discipline. And it produced meals that tasted better than most of what lines grocery store shelves today. Because when you know the cost of everything on your plate, you season it like it matters. You cook it like you mean it. You sit down and you eat it like it is worth your time. Number 15. Amish poor man's steak. Take a pound of ground beef, mix it with crushed saltine crackers, a diced onion, and an egg, then press it flat into a baking dish. Cut it into rectangles, coat each one in flour, and brown them in a skillet. Lay them back in the dish, pour a can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with a little water over the top, and bake it until everything is bubbling. Ground beef ran about 25 cents a pound through most of the 1950s, and a box of saltines was a dime. The whole dish came out to roughly 50 cents for a family of 6. This was steak night for families who could not afford a real steak. The crackers stretched the meat. The soup made the gravy. And when you pulled those rectangles out of the oven, browned on top with thick mushroom sauce underneath, nobody at the table felt like they were settling. You served it with mashed potatoes or buttered bread to soak up the gravy. Number 14. Amish succotash. Corn and lima beans. That is the heart of it. You cook them together in a pot with a knob of butter, a little salt, and sometimes a splash of cream. That was the whole recipe. But in Amish communities across Pennsylvania and Ohio, succotash was more than a side dish. It was the answer to the question of what to do with the last of the summer harvest before the frost came. The women picked the final ears of corn from the garden, cut the kernels off the cob, shelled the last of the lima beans, and put them in a pot together. It was a closing ceremony for the growing season. You ate what the land gave you, right up to the end. Some families added diced tomatoes. A few put in a little bacon for salt, but the purest version was just corn, beans, and butter, and it was enough. The sweetness of late-season corn against the starchy weight of the limas made a combination that needed nothing else. It filled a plate by itself, and with a piece of bread beside it, that was supper. What made succotash special was not the taste. It was the timing. This was a meal you ate knowing that tomorrow the garden would be finished. The jars were sealed, the root cellar was stocked, and the table shifted from fresh food to preserved food until spring. Succotash was the last fresh meal of the year, and every family at the table knew it. You did not rush through it. 40 cents for a pot that fed 6, and every spoonful tasted like the sun was leaving. Number 13. Corn pie. This was fresh corn kernels baked in a deep dish pie shell with beaten eggs, milk, butter, salt, and a dusting of pepper. Some families added a top crust. Others left it open-faced so the top turned golden in the oven. It was not sweet like corn pudding. It was savory, rich, and heavy enough to stand on its own as supper with nothing beside it but a glass of cold milk. Amish women in the Kishokokias Valley in central Pennsylvania were known for their corn pie, and each family swore their version was the right one. The arguments were friendly, but they were real. A whole pie used 4 ears of corn from the garden, 2 eggs at about 3 cents each, and a cup of milk. When the corn was growing in your own yard and the chickens were laying out back, the whole thing cost you next to nothing. Number 12. Tomato gravy on biscuits. Fry a few tablespoons of flour in bacon grease until it turns golden. Pour in canned tomatoes, stir it smooth, and let it simmer until it thickens into a rich red gravy. Split open hot biscuits and pour the gravy right over the top. This was a late summer supper in Amish country when the tomatoes were coming faster than anyone could eat them. Canning took all day. By evening, nobody wanted to look at another tomato, but they ate them anyway, poured over fresh biscuits with the kitchen windows open and the heat of August pressing against the screens. The whole meal used 2 pans, one for the biscuits, one for the gravy. Cleanup took 5 minutes. Some nights that mattered more than anything else. Number 11. Dried corn casserole. In late summer, Amish women spread fresh corn kernels on trays and dried them in the sun or in a low oven for days. That dried corn went into jars and lasted through the winter. To make the casserole, you soaked the kernels overnight, then baked them with butter, eggs, milk, sugar, and a pinch of salt. The texture was chewy and dense in a way that fresh corn never managed. It had a concentrated sweetness that came from the drying process. This was winter food, the kind that reminded you of August when there was snow on the ground. A jar of dried corn, a couple of eggs, and a splash of milk. That was all. The Amish did not follow recipes the way most cooks do today. There was no cookbook propped open on the counter. There was no timer on a phone. A woman learned to cook by standing next to her mother and watching. By the time she had her own kitchen, she knew how thick the batter should be by the way it fell from the spoon. She knew the bread was done by the sound it made when she tapped the bottom of the loaf. She knew the beans were ready by the way they smelled, not by the clock. This kind of knowledge does not transfer to a printed page. It lives in the hands and in the nose and in the memory of 10,000 suppers eaten at the same table. That is why no 2 Amish kitchens produce exactly the same dish from exactly the same ingredients. Number 10. Ham and green bean bake. Take fresh green beans, snap the ends off, and lay them in a baking dish with cubed leftover ham, sliced potatoes, and a little water. Cover it and bake it low and slow until the potatoes are soft and the beans are tender. Salt, pepper, maybe a pat of butter on top before serving. This was a one-dish supper that used whatever ham was left from Sunday dinner. The green beans came from the garden. The potatoes came from the cellar. The whole thing went into the oven and cooked itself while the family finished the evening chores. No watching, no stirring, just the oven doing its work while the day wound down. Number 9. Amish wedding steak. Despite the name, this was not steak and it was not reserved for weddings. It was thinly sliced beef layered in a roasting pan, smothered in a thick gravy made from flour, butter, and beef broth, and baked until the meat was fork tender. The gravy soaked into every layer. Amish wedding celebrations in Lancaster County could feed 200 guests at a time, and this dish was on nearly every table. Cooks used the cheapest cuts they could find, and in the 1950s, that meant about 30 cents a pound for a tough bottom round that the long bake turned tender. A full roasting pan for a family cost well under $1. It was simple enough for one cook to prepare in massive quantities, but rich enough to feel like a celebration. At home, families made a smaller version for Sunday supper. The gravy did all the heavy lifting, turning an ordinary piece of meat into something that tasted like it took all day. In truth, it took about an hour. Number 8. Hash brown casserole. Shredded potatoes mixed with sour cream, cream of chicken soup, melted butter, shredded cheese, and diced onion, spread in a baking dish and baked until golden. Some families topped it with crushed corn flakes for crunch. This showed up at every potluck, every family reunion, and every after-church lunch from Pennsylvania to Indiana. A 10-pound sack of potatoes cost about 40 cents in the 1950s, and a small container of sour cream was a nickel. Even with the cheese and soup, the whole casserole came in under $1. It was impossible to make a small batch. Even a half recipe filled a 9 by 13 pan. The women who made it did not measure. They added sour cream until it looked right and cheese until it felt like enough. Leftovers went straight into the next morning's breakfast, reheated in a skillet until the edges crisped up again. Nobody ever brought this home uneaten. Number 7. Pepper cabbage. Shred a head of cabbage, dice a green pepper and a red pepper, toss them together with vinegar, sugar, and celery seed, and let it sit in the icebox overnight. By the next day, the cabbage had softened in the brine and turned into something cool, sharp, and sweet all at once. This was served alongside nearly everything in summer: fried chicken, cold sandwiches, pork chops. But plenty of Amish families ate it as the main dish with nothing but a piece of bread and a glass of buttermilk. The crunch of raw cabbage against the tang of vinegar was enough. It cost pennies and lasted in the refrigerator for a week. This is one of the most underrated dishes in the entire Amish tradition because nobody ever talks about it outside of Lancaster County. Number 6. Pickled red beet eggs. Hard-boil a dozen eggs, peel them, and drop them into a jar of leftover red beet juice mixed with vinegar, sugar, and a few whole cloves. Let them sit for 2 or 3 days. When you pull them out, the whites are stained deep magenta all the way through and the flavor is sweet, tangy, and earthy. These sat in jars on Amish kitchen counters and were pulled out for lunch or a light supper with buttered bread and sliced onions. They were beautiful to look at, cheap to make, and lasted for weeks. Every farmer's market in Pennsylvania Dutch country still sells them today, and for good reason. The color alone stops people in their tracks. Feeding a table of 8 on $2 is not a math problem. It is a way of seeing the world. The Amish woman who made these meals did not think about grocery budgets the way a modern household does. She thought about what she had: the cellar, the garden, the chicken coop, the jar shelf. She planned meals around abundance, not around a list. When the tomatoes came in, you ate tomatoes. When the corn was ready, corn was on the table every night. When the pig was slaughtered, nothing went to waste. That relationship between the kitchen and the land right outside the door is something most of us have lost entirely. The Amish have not, and their food tastes like it. Number 5. Fried green tomatoes with white gravy. Slice firm green tomatoes thick. Dip them in flour seasoned with salt and pepper, and fry them in a hot skillet with a little lard until they turn golden and crispy on both sides. Then make a quick white gravy in the same pan using the drippings, flour, and milk. Pour it over the tomatoes and serve. This was an end-of-season supper when the frost was coming and the last tomatoes on the vine were never going to ripen. Rather than let them go to waste, you picked them green and fried them. The tartness of the unripe tomato against the rich cream gravy was a combination people remember for the rest of their lives. 2 pans, 20 minutes, and a plate that tasted like it came from a restaurant. Number 4. Potato cakes. Take leftover mashed potatoes, mix in a beaten egg and a spoonful of flour, shape them into thick patties, and fry them in butter until both sides turn crispy and brown. Serve them with applesauce on the side or a spoonful of sour cream. This was what happened to the mashed potatoes nobody finished at supper the night before. They became the next meal. No ingredient went unused. No portion went to waste. The crispy outside and the soft, warm center made them feel like something new entirely, not leftovers at all. Children asked for them by name. Some families added chopped onion or a handful of cheese. Either way, the cost was essentially zero. Number 3. Amish corn chowder. Dice potatoes and a small onion, simmer them in water until they are just tender, then add fresh corn cut from the cob, a cup of whole milk, a tablespoon of butter, and salt. Let it cook low until the broth turns creamy from the starch of the potatoes and the milk of the corn. No cream, no flour thickener. The soup thickened itself. This was a September supper when the last corn was on the counter and the potatoes were piled in the cellar. The sweetness of the corn carried the whole bowl. You served it in deep bowls with crumbled crackers on top and a piece of bread to dip. One pot fed a family of 6, and the cost was barely worth counting. Number 2. Amish skillet supper. Brown a pound of ground beef in a large cast-iron skillet with a diced onion. Add cubed potatoes, a can of corn, a can of diced tomatoes, and enough water to just cover everything. Season with salt, pepper, and a pinch of paprika. Put the lid on and let it simmer until the potatoes are cooked through, about 25 minutes. Ground beef was about 1/4 pound, potatoes cost pennies, and the canned vegetables came from last summer's harvest put up in mason jars. The whole skillet fed a table of 6 for well under $1. This was the meal that answered every question at once. What do we have? Not much. How many do we need to feed? All of them. How long do we have? About half an hour. The skillet supper asked nothing of the cook except patience and a good heavy pan. What made it special was how it changed with the seasons. In summer, the tomatoes were fresh from the garden and the corn came straight off the cob. In winter, everything came from jars put up the autumn before. The taste shifted, but the bones of the dish stayed the same. One skillet, one burner, one lid, no recipe card needed. Families in Holmes County and across northern Indiana ate some version of this 3 or 4 nights a week. It was not exciting. It was not beautiful on the plate. But when the whole family sat down and the lid came off and that first cloud of steam hit the air, something settled in the room. The work was done. The food was ready. Everyone was here. That was the whole point, really. Not the seasoning, not the technique, the gathering. Number 1. Amish chicken stew. Take a whole chicken, cover it with water, and simmer it for hours until the meat is falling apart. Pull the bones out, shred every piece of meat back into the broth, and add potatoes, carrots, celery, and onion. Let it go until the vegetables are soft and the broth is thick and golden. Salt, pepper, nothing else. A whole chicken from the yard cost nothing but the feed, and even bought from a neighbor, it ran about 40 cents in the 1950s. The vegetables came from the root cellar. The entire pot, enough for 2 days of eating, cost less than $1. This was the meal that said everything an Amish woman wanted to say without ever opening her mouth. When someone was sick, she brought chicken stew. When a baby was born, chicken stew. When a husband came in from the field exhausted and cold, chicken stew. It was the answer to every hard day because it was warm and simple and made with time she could have spent on something else, but chose to spend on you. One chicken, a few vegetables from the cellar, and a pot big enough to share. That was dinner. That was love. That was enough. Number 23, meadow tea. If you grew up anywhere near Amish country, you know this drink. It was not tea from a box. It was tea made from fresh mint pulled straight from the garden, the long stems of spearmint that grew wild along fence rows and creek banks across Lancaster and Holmes counties. An Amish woman would gather a thick handful, push it into a pot of boiling water, add sugar, and let it steep for hours. Served cold over ice, it was the only beverage besides water that appeared on most Amish tables during the warm months. No packaging, no expiration date, just mint and water and sugar. The flavor was sharper and cleaner than anything from a tea bag because dried mint loses its oils. The Amish knew that. They picked it fresh every morning and brewed it by the gallon. You think you know apple pie. You think of flaky crusts, cinnamon steam, and golden slices melting on your tongue. But this pie came from a different world. It started with dried apples, shriveled and leathery, boiled back to life in a pot of water like something rising from the past. There was no butter-laced filling, no luxury in the crust, just shortening, flour, and cold water. Sometimes brown sugar was added if you were lucky, but even that was a stretch. The result was a pie that tasted faintly of sweetness, faintly of spice, but mostly of memory. Amish families had no room for waste. When apples ripened, they were sliced thin and strung up to dry on thread across kitchens and porches. Months later, those slices were rehydrated, spiced, and baked into pies that reminded people what abundance used to taste like. This pie did not flake or sparkle. It did not melt in your mouth. But it filled your belly and gave you the sense that, just maybe, things would be all right. Goose grease was something that people called poor man's butter, but before Crisco could save the day or margarine became a staple name on everyone's tongue tips, goose grease, like beef tallow, was a common sight in most Amish kitchens and rural kitchens. It was used exactly the way you would use butter or lard. You'd use it to fry, to roast, or just to spread on toast, and make it a bit more exciting and interesting than it would otherwise be. Plus, you get grease anyway. It's like when you take a car apart and you get nuts, bolts. Okay? This analogy isn't going anywhere, but you know what did go somewhere? Goose grease. It wasn't just something people used as a cheap substitute for butter, it was also something they used a traditional folk remedy. They would rub it on the chest whenever people had congestion issues, just the way people use Vicks balm today. Amish grandmothers would die on hills swearing how this works better than any of the fancy manufactured crap you can buy in stores, and maybe they really were onto something. Either way, I'll make sure to verify the next time I have some goose grease handy on me. Number 15, sauerkraut fermentation in a crock. Every autumn, Amish families shredded heads of cabbage by the dozen, salted them, and packed them tightly into large stoneware crocks. The ratio was simple: 3 tablespoons of salt for every 5 pounds of cabbage. The salt drew moisture from the shredded leaves, creating a natural brine that submerged the cabbage without adding any water. A plate was placed on top, weighted down with a clean stone, and the crock was left in a cool corner for 2 to 4 weeks. The bacteria already present on the cabbage converted the sugars into lactic acid, preserving the cabbage and producing that sharp, tangy flavor that defined Pennsylvania Dutch cooking. No vinegar, no starter culture, just cabbage, salt, and thyme. For a senior, traditionally fermented sauerkraut provided probiotics that modern science is only now beginning to understand. There is something about the smell of butter browning in a pan that makes the whole house feel like a prayer. This was not a flashy dish. No sauce, no cheese, no garnish. Just egg noodles, boiled and tossed with browned butter and a pinch of salt. It was what you made when you had nothing, but you wanted dinner to still feel like something. Amish mothers would stir the butter over low heat until it turned golden and nutty, the scent rising like Sunday hymns. The noodles were always homemade, rolled thin on worn counters and cut with care. This dish was usually served as a side, but sometimes, when the pantry was bare, it stood proudly on its own. You would sit down, fork in hand, and suddenly the world was quiet. Warmth, salt, a bite of softness in the middle of a hard week. This recipe was not about impressing anyone. It was about reminding people they were still cared for. Dried dandelion greens were one of the most readily available sources of vitamins in Amish communities, especially rural ones. People wouldn't really rely on buying store-bought greens. Instead, Amish families had long-held cultural practices surrounding foraging. They would forage for dandelions mostly in spring and summer, and I don't know about you, but that's some real cottagecore stuff to me. Why don't my friends ever message me for a Wednesday 9 a.m. berry and dandelion picking plan? If you're the friend in the group considering this, at least shoot a text so I can live vicariously through you. Oh, but it'll be worth your while too. Dandelion greens aren't just good to the taste, but they feel a lot like spinach too. They're also extremely good for your skin, mixed with other wild greens that make an incredible salad. They work as a detox if you can mix them into a tonic, and Amish communities would essentially ground them into this coffee-like beverage that would help a lot with stomach issues. Number 20, root cellar temperature zones. Amish families without refrigeration kept food fresh for months using a room most modern homes do not have. The root cellar was dug into a hillside, where the earth maintained a temperature between 32 and 40 degrees through winter. But the real genius was the organization. Potatoes went on the floor, in the coldest and most humid area. Apples went on shelves higher up, because apples stored too cold turned mealy. Onions hung from the ceiling in mesh bags because they needed air circulation, or they rotted. Squash sat on straw-lined shelves near the ceiling, because squash needed 50 degrees and low humidity. Every vegetable had a place. Every fruit had a shelf. And the arrangement was not random. It was science passed down through generations of farming families who could not afford to lose a single potato to spoilage. Schnitz and Knepp was not a dish you stumbled into. It was a dish passed down in quiet voices and heavy iron pots. Dried apple slices, known as schnitz, simmered with chunks of smoked ham in a sweet, salty bath that filled every room with the scent of a time before shortcuts. Then came the knep, doughy dumplings that puffed and floated, tender and absorbing. It was a collision of pantry and pasture, preserved fruit and salted meat tied together with soft flour clouds that tasted like your grandmother's hands. This was not just dinner. This was a moment, a slow-cooked reward after a week of hard labor, a gathering meal meant to stretch, to soothe, to hold. Amish families knew how to work with time. They let the apples soak, let the ham infuse, and dropped the dumplings in only when everything was ready. There was no rush. There was only rhythm. It came out in one pot, served with ladles and silence, and by the end, there was nothing left but the memory of warmth. So throw out the Crisco and the Wesson bottles because I'm about to show you what the original cooking fat used to be. See, back in the days of your great-grandparents and the typical setting of the Red Dead series, you could pretty much expect everyone to be carrying around some beef tallow, especially if you were living in Amish households or visiting them regularly. In rural areas, whenever cattle would be slaughtered, it would be an unspoken rule to ensure that every part of the cow that was butchered would be used. This included all the internal organs, but it also meant the protective layers of fat around those organs. Also, beef tallow used to be something people USD when they didn't even have kerosene lamps and gas lighting, so they would make tallow candles from scratch and use that for light. A lot of themes wore that it really does something extra for a pie crust too, apparently. It makes them extra crispy and flaky. Not just that, Amish families also thoroughly relied on beef tallow for making soap, so they definitely knew their way around a can of this stuff. Number 18. Friendship Bread Starter. In Amish communities across Pennsylvania and Ohio, a small jar of sourdough starter was one of the most meaningful gifts a woman could give her neighbor. The starter was a mixture of flour, sugar, milk, and a pinch of yeast that fermented over 10 days on the kitchen counter. Each day, the woman stirred it with a wooden spoon. On the 10th day, she divided it into portions, kept one for herself, and gave the rest away with handwritten instructions. The bread that came from this starter was soft, slightly sweet, and laced with cinnamon. But the recipe was almost beside the point. The act of sharing was the real tradition. It connected households. It gave women a reason to knock on a neighbor's door. For a senior living alone, receiving a jar of Friendship Bread Starter meant someone was thinking of you. That jar was not just flour and milk, it was an invitation to stay connected. They looked like ornaments for a table that had seen too much winter. The eggs, stained deep purple from soaking in beet brine, were stacked in glass jars on every Amish farmhouse shelf. This was not just a recipe, it was a ritual. First, boil the eggs. Then peel them and submerge them in a pickling liquid made from vinegar, sugar, cloves, and the juice from home-canned red beets. Over the next few days, the eggs soaked up the color until they glowed like lanterns. They were sweet, tangy, earthy, and electric. A jolt of flavor when food otherwise tasted like ration books and old shoes. You saw them at barn weddings, funerals, and church picnics. No one ever asked for them. They just showed up, quietly certain of their place. Amish cooks understood the art of preservation, but this went beyond that. It was a way to give something plain, something overlooked, a new identity. It told you that color mattered, that even humble eggs could be transformed into something almost divine. Corn cob jelly is a pretty pioneer recipe. It's something that originated in Amish kitchens where, again, the idea was to avoid wastage as much as you could, right? That didn't just mean the animal and living things you slaughtered to eat. It also meant that after you took out the kernels from the sweet corn, you wouldn't leave the cobs alone. No, those were boiled so that the natural sugar and flavors that were in them could be extracted. And that would pretty much make this really exquisite honey-like jelly. And the color of this would switch up too. So if you were using your typical yellow corn cob, then you would get this really overly golden and honey-looking jelly. But if you used red corn cobs, then you would get a red or pink-hued jelly that was really similar to strawberry jam. Funnily enough, despite being made from corn cobs, a lot of people often said that it just felt like it tasted like honey or apple jelly. This did mean that it was an incredible, free, and natural alternative to honey, when it would be too expensive, or when budgets were tight. Hey, it's still something you can find in local Amish markets and roadside farm stands, so it's not completely forgotten, but it's not even 25% as widespread as it used to be. Number 19. Chow Chow Relish. This was the condiment that appeared on every Amish table from September through March, and it solved a problem every gardener faces at the end of summer. The last green tomatoes, the final handful of beans, the cauliflower that did not quite make it to full size. All of it went into chow chow. An Amish woman would chop everything into small pieces, pour a hot brine of vinegar, sugar, mustard seed, and celery seed over the top, and pack the jars while the kitchen windows fogged from the steam. The result was a sweet and tangy relish that tasted different every year because the vegetables were never exactly the same twice. Chow chow turned waste into something worth putting on the table. Here is what most people do not understand about Amish cooking. It was not a cuisine. It was an economy. Every recipe on this list exists because someone refused to let food go to waste. The chow chow jar was not a side dish. It was a philosophy. The idea that everything the garden produced had value, even the last crooked pepper on the vine, even the green tomato that never turned red. Amish kitchens did not have garbage disposals because they did not produce garbage. Everything was eaten, preserved, composted, or fed to the animals. Nothing left the cycle. For a senior who grew up in a house where the trash can was nearly empty after supper, that memory is not nostalgia. It is a standard that modern kitchens have quietly abandoned. Breakfasts were different back then. You did not scroll a phone or sip a $6 latte. You stood over the stove flipping slabs of fried cornmeal mush until the kitchen smelled like waking up on the right side of the world. Amish homes made this by instinct. Cold, leftover mush from yesterday's pot, cut into thick rectangles, pan-fried in lard or butter until golden and crispy on the outside, creamy on the inside. It came alive with maple syrup or sometimes sorghum if that was all you had. This was the food of farmers, of children with frost in their hair and dirt on their shoes, of women in aprons who measured nothing but got it right anyway. The mush started as a simple boiling of cornmeal and buttermilk, whisked until it thickened and poured into pans to cool overnight. The next morning you sliced it like bread and gave it a second life. And that is what it was, really. A second life for leftovers, a second life for mornings that felt like they would never end. In a world that forgets what it means to make do, this dish still whispers a lesson. You do not need much to make something good. You just need to care. Shoe fly pie filling was really something that showed you the sheer potential molasses had. This was a filling that was entirely made from a lot of molasses, brown sugar, butter, flour, and some eggs, only to make this really gooey, rich filling that had a sweet flavor but also a slight taste. So you had a wet bottom choufle pie which was really soft, right? It was like that typical custard eye molasses texture you're super used to. It also settles right at the bottom, and the dry bottom choux fly pie was something that had a cake-like consistency. It was first something people often enjoyed as this coffee cake substitute, but it was also something people loved thanks to how sticky and sweet it was. I know that seems like a bit of a weird thing to say, but textures don't make sense to me either. Neither does the name choufle, which apparently came from the fact that even flies were deeply attracted to the scent of sweet molasses being carried for miles and miles as the pies would cool on farmhouse windowsills or next to windmills. Number 25. Salt rising bread. This was the bread Amish grandmothers made before commercial yeast existed in packets on grocery store shelves. Instead of yeast, they used a starter made from cornmeal, salt, and warm milk left to ferment overnight near the wood stove. The bacteria in the cornmeal produced gas that lifted the dough over 12 to 14 hours. The result was a bread with a dense, fine crumb and a faintly tangy smell that old-timers in Holmes County, Ohio, still describe as the smell of their childhood. You could not rush it. You could not skip the overnight rise. The bread demanded its own schedule, and in return, it gave you something no bakery loaf could match. Modern bread relies on speed. This bread relied on time. and time was the one ingredient Amish kitchens never ran short of. Mincemeat pies were once the jewel of a table. But when meat ran out, when fruit spoiled, and when sugar was hard to come by, people turned to what was still left in the garden: green tomatoes. Tart, firm, and stubbornly unripe, these were peeled, chopped, and cooked down with vinegar, cinnamon, and raisins if you had them. The result was a pie filling that tasted oddly familiar but haunting in its own way. It did not pretend to be meat. It just reminded you that flavor could come from the most unexpected places. Amish cooks passed this one down quietly, almost protectively, like a secret too strange to share with the outside world. The mixture was sticky, dark, and spiced, preserved in jars and spooned into pies that looked like any other from the outside. And that was the point: to look normal, to feel normal. In a world where nothing was, these pies were a trick of the heart. You could feed a whole family on green tomatoes and no one would feel cheated. You know how I keep mentioning that people back then had a real deep-seated mentality of not letting a singular thing go to waste? Well, scrapple was something that was made by German settlers and Pennsylvania Dutch families. It was something they relied on so that every possible part of the pig would be used up and consumed, because that was just free nutrition you were leaving up on the table. Hey, nothing was excluded. Sure, you might be going for some unfamiliar names like the liver, the heart, the head meat, scraps, etc., but people wouldn't even leave the eyes and brains. Not sure if I entirely disagree with that, but I definitely see the benefit. Anyway, scrapple is something that you slice and fry in a really hot pan until you get that to die for texture on the outside. You know that crunch that fixes you? That's what we fry things for. A Pennsylvania Dutch breakfast staple was literally just homemade or leftover scrapple, and this was one of the most popular things in not just a lot of different Amish communities, but a lot of regional communities throughout Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. Number 22. Egg noodle drying on chairbacks. Amish egg noodles were not the thin, brittle things you find in a cellophane bag at the grocery store. They were thick, golden ribbons made from flour, eggs, and a pinch of salt, rolled out by hand on a floured kitchen table and cut into wide strips. Then the noodles were draped over the backs of wooden kitchen chairs, across broomsticks balanced between two counters, and over porch railings on warm days. They dried for hours in the open air, losing just enough moisture to hold their shape. When you dropped them into a pot of chicken broth, they puffed up soft and tender, absorbing the flavor of the stock as they cooked. These noodles were the backbone of Pennsylvania Dutch chicken pot pie, a dish that has almost nothing in common with the frozen pot pies in your supermarket. There is nothing appetizing about the word sour, especially when it comes to breakfast. But back then, when milk went past its prime, you did not pour it down the drain. You made pancakes, thick, golden, soft in the middle, with edges that crisped like lace in a hot cast-iron skillet. These were not just pancakes. These were proof that waste was a luxury no one could afford. Amish cooks knew sour milk still had value. It brought tang, lift, and tenderness to whatever it touched. Mixed with flour, eggs, and baking soda, it transformed a nearly spoiled liquid into something warm and good. You could smell them across the yard, especially when maple syrup hit the hot griddle. They were often eaten plain or with butter scraped from a homemade churn. But even dry, they did the job, and the job was simple. Keep the family fed, stretch what you had, and find joy in what was nearly thrown away. It takes a kind of quiet brilliance to make something beautiful out of something spoiled. Pickled red beets are something that are a must-have side dish for most Amish families and their dinner time, and it's always something you see being served with American classics like roast chicken, pot roast, or some ham. Beets were always grown in most gardens that Amish families had, since relying on agricultural practices to help sustain supplies was a common thing for them. Amish versions of these pickled beets tend to be a lot sweeter than the grocery store Overzion, which I'm not really sure why, except of course that delectable brine they make. Throw some vinegar, sugar, cinnamon, cloves, and allspice in, and you have yourself an incredible kind of broth and brine. Eggs would typically be pickled in the brine along with it, and one of the most popular things to do was to basically just take these hard-boiled eggs where the beet brine that's left over is used for soaking them. Then they get this really aesthetic pink color and a taste you can't miss anywhere, so now your food can be just as pretty as you. Number 17, red beet pickled eggs. In every Amish farmhouse cold cellar, there was a jar of eggs sitting in dark purple brine. Hard-boiled eggs were peeled and placed into a jar with sliced pickled beets, vinegar, sugar, and a few whole cloves. Over 2 or 3 days, the brine turned the egg whites a deep magenta all the way through. They tasted faintly sweet, faintly tangy, and unmistakably Amish. For a senior, red beet eggs were the perfect protein that required no cooking on the day you ate them. You made a batch on Monday and pulled eggs from the jar all week. No reheating, no standing at the stove. The cloves were the secret. Most modern recipes leave them out, and the result tastes flat. The old Amish women knew that 3 or 4 whole cloves in the brine changed everything. You would swear it was pecan pie. You would swear you tasted toasted nuts, caramel, and richness. But there were no pecans, just oats. Rolled oats soaked in a syrupy mixture of eggs, sugar, and a splash of vanilla, baked until the top set and the middle jiggled just enough. This was the pie you made when you could not afford pecans, but still wanted to feel like you could. The Amish were masters of illusion in the kitchen, not to deceive, but to protect. To protect dignity, to protect joy, to protect the simple act of dessert after a hard day's labor. The oats mimicked the crunch, the sugar mimicked the depth, and the crust, barely patched together with lard and flour, held it all with quiet grace. You might find a version of this pie in a church cookbook or scribbled on a yellowing index card in someone's attic. It is not flashy, but it is brilliant. A reminder that taste is not about expense. It is about intention. And sometimes, what you remember is not the pecans. It is the feeling that someone cared enough to make pie, even when they had nothing. Dried soup beans were a big staple for winters, and Amish families pretty much relied on dried beans being stored in bulk levels to last throughout the winter. They were really economical, super filling, and they lasted an entirety if you knew how to take care of them. Of course, the Amish were experts in that. They were also just really common in most Amish one-pot meals like thick soups and stews, but they had a bit of a preference for beans. It seems most communities didn't really step outside the usual routine of navy beans, pinto and lima beans, and great northern beans. The pinto beans were honestly just there because some Amish-Mexican hybrid food would slap harder than it had any right to. Ham and bean soup, which great northern beans were pretty much typically used for, was used in one of the most classic Amish meals. Ham and bean soup was made by simmering lots of navy beans with ham hocks, and it was delicious. I mean, it was really punching above its weight. Number 24. Cast iron seasoning with lard. Every Amish kitchen had at least one cast iron skillet that was older than the woman using it. The seasoning was not a coating you could buy. It was built over decades, layer by layer, meal after meal. The secret was lard. Not vegetable oil, not cooking spray. Rendered lard from the family pig, rubbed thin across the surface after every wash and heated until it bonded to the iron. Amish women never used soap on their cast iron. They scraped it clean with a flat spatula, wiped it with a damp cloth, then rubbed a fingertip of lard across the cooking surface while the pan was still warm. Cornbread slid out clean every time. Eggs did not stick. The pan was the most valuable tool in the kitchen because it carried the flavor of every meal that had come before. Forget the stuff in plastic wrap. Amish bologna loaf was a homemade wonder, dense, spiced, and shaped with purpose. It started with ground meat, usually pork or beef scraps, mixed with mustard, garlic, coriander, and whatever else the cellar still offered. Then it was packed into a tin loaf pan, slow-baked until the edges browned and the aroma filled the house like a promise. Sliced thick or thin, served hot or cold, it was school lunch, Sunday dinner, and midnight snack all in one. Unlike store-bought versions, this loaf had depth, texture, soul, the kind you only get from mixing something with your own hands. It was frugal, yes, but never poor. It was a statement. You did not need a butcher to eat well. You just needed a recipe and some resolve. Sometimes it was glazed with molasses. Other times it was wrapped in cloth and smoked in a homemade smokehouse behind the barn. Pickled eggs were an Amish deli favorite and have had pretty strong cultural connections and roots for a while, particularly to Amish country kitchens and rural American bars. They were the kind of thing you would keep on your shelf in those obscenely large jars or bar tops, and they were also a wonderful way to deal with a problem you'd love to be having. Too many eggs? Yup. Amish families were most often farm families, and let's just say hens have an incredibly productive schedule when it comes to egg production. The Amish communities in the area therefore came up with a number of different ways to deal with eggs, pickled ones being the best and most popular. But hey, they didn't only know how to work with beet brine. Amish families had pickled eggs in spicy garlic brines, sweet and sour vinegar brines, and bread and butter pickles. They were pickled eggs that had been served alongside all kinds of sandwiches or fried chicken or ham. It was just a really easy and quick snack to grab on your way to work or as you were picking your kid up from school. Number 16. Wood stove heat zone cooking. An Amish woman cooking on a wood-burning stove did not have temperature dials. She had zones. The area directly above the firebox was the hottest, reaching temperatures high enough to sear meat and boil water in minutes. The far side of the stovetop was barely warm, suitable for keeping a pot of soup at a gentle simmer for hours. An experienced cook used all of these zones simultaneously. She would brown onions over the firebox, slide the pan to the center for a steady cook, then move it to the far edge to hold. Pies went on the hot side of the oven first to set the crust, then slid to the cooler side to finish without burning. There were no timers. She tested bread by holding her hand inside the oven and counting seconds. 3 seconds meant the oven was hot enough for biscuits. 5 seconds meant it was right for a slow roast. That knowledge lived in her hands, not in a manual. Most people have heard of shoofly pie, but few remember its fluffier, quieter sibling, the shoofly cake. This was the kind of dessert you found on a counter at your grandmother's house, covered with a faded linen towel and dusted with molasses crumbs. Unlike the sticky pie, shoofly cake was lighter, baked in a sheet pan, and sliced into neat brown squares that stuck to your fingers in all the best ways. It was made for Sundays, for unexpected guests, for potlucks and funerals, and sometimes just because someone was craving something sweet in the middle of a week that had gone sour. Amish kitchens had their rhythm, and shoofly cake was one of those steady beats. The magic was in its use of basic staples: molasses, flour, baking soda, and hot water. No frosting, no fruit, no filling. Just a dense, caramel-flavored bite that told you sugar was a gift and not a guarantee. It came from frugality, from scraping the barrel and still baking something worth remembering. So, home-canned venison wasn't just something that Amish people would use for food. For Amish families and also for a lot of rural homesteaders, home-canned venison was a very important way of preservation. It was something they relied on to store wild game meat, as a lot of them didn't have access to refrigeration, and many Amish communities didn't use electricity. Canned venison was a way for them to keep meat shelf stable, not just for an extended amount of time, but for months and years. Pressure canning was also really helpful because meat just wasn't like fruits and vegetables. You had to pressure the stuff so that it would kill all the harmful bacteria swimming around that was definitely looking to kill you. Plus, canned venison wasn't just something you didn't need refrigeration for. It was also something you didn't need a freezer for. Lots of Amish families also preferred the canned variants over the frozen ones because they believed you got a really rich flavor right out of the jar thanks to it being condensed for so long. It really took all of its time to absorb all the seasonings, you know? Number 21. Apple butter in a copper kettle. Every autumn across Lancaster County, Amish communities gathered for apple butter boils. A massive copper kettle was set over an open fire in the yard. Bushels of apples, peeled and cored by a group of women the night before, were dumped in with cider, sugar, and cinnamon. Then someone stirred. For 8 hours. The long wooden paddle never stopped moving because if the apple butter scorched on the bottom, the entire batch was ruined. Children took turns. Grandmothers supervised. By evening, the mixture had cooked down into a thick, dark spread that tasted nothing like the pale jars in the grocery store. It was deep and smoky from the open fire, and it lasted in sealed jars through the entire winter. The secret was not the recipe. It was the copper kettle and the 8 hours of stirring that no modern shortcut could replicate. Spring did not announce itself with flowers. It arrived with dandelion greens, plucked from yards before the sun got too high, rinsed 3 times, and simmered into gravy that turned the air green with memory. Amish families knew the first edible sign of the season was not found at a store. It grew wild and unwanted, but never unneeded. The greens were bitter, yes, but boiled and sautéed with flour, lard, and a splash of vinegar, they transformed into something tender and tangy. The gravy clung to potatoes, boiled with skin still on, and turned the plate into a celebration. This was not food from luxury. This was food from hope. You knew winter was over when the dandelions came back. And in that moment, nothing tasted better. Children did not always love the bitterness, but they learned to. Because it meant full bellies. It meant spring. It meant something was growing again. No waste, no pretense, just weeds turned into welcome. Sorghum syrup was, and I really need to stress this, not the same thing as molasses. I mean, sure, maybe people threw in some molasses there, typically blackstrap ones, but sorghum syrup was something that just came from sorghum cane and not sugar cane. It had a much fruitier and lighter texture, and it was also sour, had molasses, and had a lot of benefits to your skin just like dandelions do. But see, making sorghum syrup really wasn't easy. In fact, a lot of people regarded it as this massive community effort. In Amish farm communities or southern communities, it was a big practice for families to get together, make an entire day out of it, and begin harvesting the tall sorghum stalks. They would run those bad boys through a horse or a mule-powered press just to get some of that good juice out, and that juice was then boiled down for literally hours. Imagine the scent. It was boiled just so it would thicken into a really rich syrup, and by now you might have noticed that a lot of Amish recipes rely on boiling and reducing things to syrups and jellies, and I think I'm really vibing with that. I mean, everyone can make a meatloaf, but how many people do you know that can whip up 5 different types of syrups and jellies on a whim? Number 14. Scrapple from scratch. This was the dish that separated the Amish kitchen from every other kitchen in America. After a family butchered a pig in late autumn, the head, liver, heart, and every scrap that did not go into roasts was simmered until the meat fell apart. The broth was strained, the meat chopped fine, and then cornmeal and buckwheat flour were stirred in with sage, thyme, salt, and pepper until the mixture thickened into a dense porridge. It was poured into loaf pans, cooled until firm, and sliced thin for frying. A slice of scrapple fried crisp in cast iron, golden brown at the edges and soft in the center, was the centerpiece of an Amish breakfast that fueled a full day of farm work. The secret was the cornmeal. It absorbed the pork flavor and gave scrapple its distinctive texture. Butchering Day was a community event, and the women who ran the scrapple pot were considered the most skilled cooks in the settlement. Getting the cornmeal ratio right, sensing the thickness by the way the spoon moved through the pot, these were things you learned by standing next to your grandmother for 20 years. For a senior who remembers the smell of scrapple frying on a cold November morning, that memory is tied to an entire world that has mostly disappeared from American kitchens. It was not crunchy like coleslaw from a plastic tub. It was better, softer, tangier, made from finely shredded cabbage, carrots if you had them, and a vinegar-based dressing that hit you with bite and then backed off with sweetness. The secret was the celery seed, just enough to tickle your nose and remind you that flavor does not need volume, just clarity. This slaw sat in glass bowls at every gathering that mattered. Weddings, barn raisings, Sunday suppers where 3 generations shared a table. The cabbage was often from the garden, pulled and chopped the same day. The dressing was made on the stove. Sugar, vinegar, mustard, oil, then poured hot over the vegetables so they softened just right. It was not crisp. It was tender, familiar. like eating something your great-grandmother once knew by heart. And every forkful reminded you that old-fashioned did not mean outdated. It meant tested, trusted, true. In a world of thick mayonnaise and shortcuts, this slaw is a revelation, a revival. And once you taste it, you will not crave anything else. Pick one of these recipes, just one. Make it this week. Not from a box, not from a freezer, but from scratch with your own hands. Set the table properly, sit down, eat slowly. If you made the rivel soup, you already know it takes 5 minutes. If you tried the skillet supper, you know a single pan can feed a family. Drop a comment and tell me which one you are making first. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. More videos like this are coming. I will see you in the next one.